Can you hear? Can you hear? Can you hear me? God, can you hear me now? God, can you hear? Can you hear? Can you hear me? I cry to you with all my power. Through the veil of Jesus' flesh, from this valley strewn with tears, I can climb up to the mountain of the Father. For he lives to hear the pleas from his children worn and weak, as they come into his presence with their praise. God, can you hear? Can you hear? Can you hear me? God, can you hear me now? God, can you hear? Can you hear? Can you hear me? I cry to you with all my power. I can pray in Jesus' name for my will to be the same. For the Father wants to mold me in his image. For he knows what's best for me. If I'm bound or if I'm free, I can come into his presence with my praise. God, can you hear? Can you hear? Can you hear me? God, can you hear me now? I know that God, you will hear, you will hear, you will hear me. You will heal me. You will hold me. You will push me by your power.
Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. Dreams are odd things, aren't they? If you're like me, most of your dreams don't necessarily make all that much sense, right? They're just kind of these weird stories that seem to sort of mesh all these different things that we experience together, right? Yet, how oftentimes do we find ourselves maybe sitting around a dinner table or maybe a breakfast table talking about the dreams that we've had? I know that sometimes my kids talk about the dreams that they had or something, and it's just maybe even at work we might sit around the table and talk about our dreams that we have had for various reasons. And many times we kind of think about how the dreams that we have, they're like our own subconscious way of understanding the ways in which we experience the world around us. But what if we thought of our dreams like God was giving those to us? Or, in fact, like the Hebrew writer had talked about that we just looked at, in Hebrews 1, he talks about there was so many different ways in which God spoke to people, and one of those ways was through dreams. And I want us to take a look at the person of Joseph. Now, this is not Joseph and Mary that we get in the New Testament, okay? It's a different Joseph. This is Joseph in the coat of many colors Joseph, the one that I have labeled right here as the dreamer. In fact, I told my family what I was going to be talking about, and while they were at the store, they came across this plant right here, and that's the background, by the way. I was kind of wondering, what am I going to do for the background? And this is the reason why this plant is the background. Because my son found this plant that's called amaranth, but it's also notice that it's also labeled there as Joseph's coat. Yeah, that goes back to the Joseph's coat of many colors, right? Well, that's this Joseph that we're going to see, and we're going to see how dreams play a part in his story and kind of drive this story home to us. And there's going to be some lessons, I believe, that we can learn through Joseph, and the patience and the endurance and the trust in God that he has. Let's take a look at his story together. Now, his story is going to really begin in Genesis 37, and it's going to go all the way through the end of Genesis. Now, we're not going to look at all of those, but the first passage from Genesis I have is going to come in 37, and then the last passage is going to be the last chapter. So, we're going to skip a whole lot in between it. And it's a wonderful story, but here is how it starts. Not exactly the greatest start. Genesis 37, verses 2 through 4, that this is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made him an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. There's that, as the NIV translates it in verse 3, that an ornate robe. Yeah, okay. We're used to calling it a coat of many colors, right? So I'm still probably going to refer to that as a coat of many colors. That was a gift that was showing that Joseph is going to be on a different level than his brothers. His father, he loved him more than what his brothers were. Now, at this time, I want you to pay attention to the passing of time because, we're going to be seeing a bunch of these different chapters, but notice the passing of time. The first time we're told about his age is he's 17 years old. And then we see that his brothers, they hated him because of, he's the favorite son, right? They hated him. They couldn't speak a kind word to him. But keep reading because it even kind of gets a little bit worse than just that. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. So notice right here that Joseph had a dream, and then he, like so many times, we gather around breakfast, we talk about the dreams that we had. Hey, listen to this dream. Well, here, though, they recognize these dreams would be something that God would be giving them. God would be giving them some type of insight into what is going on. And because of how this dream was, kind of interpreted, they were like, what, are you going to reign over us? He already has the special robe. Now he's got these dreams about reigning over them. They don't like it. They hate him because of his dream and because of what he said about his dream. But that's not the only dream that he has. Verses 9 through 11, then he had another dream and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream. And this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. See, his father was kind of paying attention to what this was, right? His brothers are still jealous. They hated him because of his dream, because of what he said about this dream. They just did not like him, and they wanted to put an end to him. In fact, later on in this chapter, that's exactly what they're going to do. A few verses later, picking back up now in verse 17, we read that Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in a distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." Notice how central this story of this idea of dreams is to the story of Joseph. He's had these dreams. His brothers don't like it. They don't like it at all. They call him that dreamer. They are already plotting to kill him. They are going to, get rid of him. And then they're going to see, well, what is going to come of his dreams? Well, the rest of this story, it goes on throughout, the rest of the book of Genesis. But I want us to kind of pause here and let's get a summary that is given for us in a sermon that's found in the New Testament. This is a sermon that Stephen gives in Acts chapter 7. And this is how he summarizes this. In verses 9 and 10, Stephen says, "Because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, they sold him as a slave into Egypt. But God was with him and rescued him from all his troubles. He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So Pharaoh made him ruler over Egypt and all his palace." That was found in Acts 7. I don't know if I said the right chapter earlier, but this is the passage that is given in a summary form in that sermon. Because Stephen knew the history, and this was an important part. They were jealous, but then notice that God was with him. God was always with him. God was going to do great things through Joseph. And then as you continue on, we read that verses 11 through 15, that then a famine struck all Egypt and Canaan, bringing great suffering, and our ancestors could not find food. When Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our forefathers on their first visit. On their second visit, Joseph told his brothers who he was, and Pharaoh learned about Joseph's family. After this, Joseph sent for his father Jacob and his whole family, 75 in all. Then Jacob went down to Egypt, where he and our ancestors died. So that's kind of how it's summarized, and that's pretty much from the beginning and the end of this story. But obviously, there's a lot of details that are looked over, and so let's kind of drop down at a few of these details that were overlooked in this summary story. But I wanted us to get that big picture so that we sort of see this idea that God was always with them. God was always working this great thing so that their lives could still be a blessing to all the nations, just like he promised Abraham, right? Well, some of the summaries, some of the details that the summary overlooks are like found right here in Genesis 39. I'm not going to read everything that's on the screen, but here we find out about this Potiphar. So one of the first stops that Joseph makes whenever he goes to Egypt is he goes to Potiphar. So now Joseph is a young man. He's taken away from his family. His family is the one that betrayed him, his brothers. And then he is sold as a slave, and he's going to find himself with Potiphar, who's an Egyptian, who's an official and everything of Pharaoh. But that's where he finds himself. But then we see what happens whenever he is a slave and he's in a foreign land. Well, verse 2 of Genesis 39 still tells us that the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. We also find out it's not just Joseph that prospered, also people around him prospered. I think there's kind of a lesson with that because in verse 5 of this chapter, we find out that the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. So sometimes whenever the Lord blesses us, sometimes also people around us get blessed too. Now, maybe that might give us a little motivation to be around people who the Lord is blessing so that we can also receive some of those blessings as well. But here, however you kind of want to take this, God is in the middle of everything that's going on, and he is going to be working great things. However, it doesn't look like that from Joseph's perspective. Remember, he's a slave, and then he's in Potiphar's household. Things look like they're going well, but then he's actually thrown in prison of no fault of his own, but he is wrongly accused of something, and he is thrown in prison. And while he's in prison, he meets these two people who, you guessed it, they had dreams. It was the baker and the cupbearer. And they talk to him about how, well, they've got these dreams and they want to know the interpretation, but nobody knows it. And then Joseph responds. He still has this wonderful faith in God. And he says, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams, because he knows he's been given this gift by God to be able to interpret the dreams. God is the one who knows the interpretations. So in prison, Joseph is interpreting those dreams, tells one of them good news, one of them not so good news, okay? But right here, this passage, you look at all the bad things that's happening in Joseph's life, but Joseph is still pointing toward God. He is still recognizing who God is and what God is doing. And it puts this verse that I want us to look at really to the test when you look at the life of Joseph. This is a famous passage in Romans 8:28. It says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." The story of Joseph, as well as other stories, they put this verse to the test. Because when you look at this passage, maybe we share this passage sometimes to encourage one another. And I think there's a lot of encouragement from this verse. But what if you were Joseph? Just knowing that God works all things together for good, does it really help you in those moments? Yeah, yeah, it does. But it can be hard to see. I don't know exactly how Joseph was able to see it, but God was working in the life of Joseph. So now let's go back to the story of Joseph. He's in prison. He's interpreted those dreams. God gave him the interpretation, okay? And then the chief cupbearer, he is going to be free from prison. He's going to go back to the service of Pharaoh. So then Joseph says to him, okay, remember me. Don't forget about me, okay? But in Genesis 40:23, we read the chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. And verse 1 of the next chapter says, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Do you understand what's happening right here? Joseph has been taken away from his family. A lot of bad stuff has happened to him. Then even whenever it looks like he's got a moment to be free, the cupbearer forgets about him. He's still in prison for 2 years. Time is still passing on. But now Pharaoh had a dream. And whenever Pharaoh had a dream, this gives Joseph an opportunity to stand before Pharaoh. So let's hear this dream that Pharaoh had. So Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside them on the river bank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. Yeah, kind of an odd dream, right? It's very similar to our dreams, right? But that's not the only dream that Pharaoh had. In Genesis 41, 5 through 8, he fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched like the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent all over for the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. He had a problem. What is he going to do? He's had these 2 dreams. Nobody can interpret them. And then enters Joseph. Because what happens is, oh yeah, all of a sudden the cupbearer is reminded, oh yeah, there's this guy in prison. Pharaoh sends for Joseph. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph in Genesis 41, 15 through 16, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Even now, Joseph has so much faith in God. He knows it's not his own abilities. You know, sometimes whenever the Lord gives us different abilities, sometimes we kind of can be a little boastful. It can be easy for us to be boastful. It could have been easy for Joseph to be like, oh yeah, okay, just tell me your dream, and I'll tell you the interpretation. Okay, we'll just do this. It'll be a great thing. But no, no, no. That's not how Joseph is. Joseph is humble. He said, I can't interpret it. To Joseph, a dream probably sounded just as weird to him as it did to everybody else. But God knows the interpretation. By the way, the interpretation had to do with there was going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 good years, and then there was going to be 7 years of famine. What are you going to do? Well, Joseph had a plan, and whenever he told Pharaoh what his plan was, it was to save back a certain portion and to be able to dish it out later. That was his plan. And then Pharaoh said, that's a great idea. And Joseph was 30 years old whenever he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. He was given the task to enact that plan. And this is what we find in Genesis 41, verse 46. So Joseph is 30 years old now. Do you realize how much time has passed? Joseph was 17 the first time we hear about him. Now he's 30 years old. Nearly 15 years has passed. I guess 13 if you want to be technical. 13 years has passed already. A couple more are still going to come before he ever reveals himself to his brothers. Time is passing. Like I said, it puts that verse to the test about how God works out all things for good. We don't always see it as quickly as we might expect, but God is still working out good things in our lives. So when Joseph is given the ability to enact this plan, what's going to happen? Well, his brothers are told by their father that, hey, look, we've heard there is grain in Egypt. What are you doing standing around here? Just go there. Get us some food so that we can live and not die. That's what we get here in this passage is right here at the end of chapter 41 and the beginning of chapter 42. So now the brothers are given the task to go before Joseph, their brother they sold. They don't know he's their brother, though. And in this weird chain of events, what we see is the brothers come before their own brother, that dreamer, and they're going to find out what came of his dreams, right? In Genesis 42, verses 6 and 7, and then a little bit in verse 9, we read that now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brother arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. But you see in verse 9, he remembered his dreams about them. He knew what was going on, and he knew this was a fulfillment of those dreams. They bowed down to him whenever they saw him. They didn't know. They didn't know they were doing exactly what the dream said was going to happen. Because it's kind of weird, you know. How is that going to happen? He's not really the one that's supposed to be in charge, but yet he is, because of this weird chain of events that has happened to him. But the Lord blessed the life of Joseph, and great things happened to him. And Joseph, after a weird chain of events, you know, it goes all through about how he pretends to be a stranger, he speaks harshly to them, and I'm just going to tell you, he does a bunch of things that I think it all comes down to he's testing his brothers to see if they really are, good now, if they've changed, or if they're just the same as what they always were. And then at some point, he is ready to reveal who he is. As you can imagine, his brothers are definitely shocked by all of that. And this is what is stated whenever he reveals his identity. In Genesis chapter 45, then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one who you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you." Notice his faith. He is still talking about how it's God who did these things. Verse 7, "But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt." Notice this faith. He knew that concept, that verse in Romans, about how God causes all things to work together for good. God does. God can. And God was doing that right here. He was bringing about salvation, but in a much different way than what we might expect. And even at the very end of the book of Genesis, what happens is Joseph, his father, has died. His brothers are concerned about what's going to happen to them now. In Genesis 50, verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" But listen to Joseph's response. Verse 19, "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.'" And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Aren't there so many lessons we can learn from the life of Joseph? They might have intended to harm Joseph, but God intended it for good. He intended it for deliverance, for salvation of lives. And that's exactly what happened. That was God's plan all along. Kind of a weird way of getting there, right? But notice that God was giving guidance. God was telling Joseph what was happening all throughout it. And notice how dreams are a way that God spoke, and Joseph listened. And great things came to him, and blessings came to him whenever he listened to the messages that came from God. Going back to the verses that we started with, the book of Hebrews starts off that in the past God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom also he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So he became as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. This is all talking about the Son of God. This is all talking about Jesus Christ himself. Yes, God has spoken in so many different ways that are kind of weird. All these visions, these dreams, and all these ways that he has spoken to the prophets for thousands of years. But now, verse 2 reminds us, he now speaks to us through Jesus, through the words of Jesus, through the guidance of Jesus. And through Jesus, he, in a very weird way, just like the life of Joseph, Through Jesus, he has provided purification for sins. Yes, it seems so odd that with Jesus Christ, his death brings us life, brings us purification for our sins. But that's exactly what's at the heart of the gospel message. The God who created everything around us, he made the universe. He has this powerful word that we are called to listen to today. He has provided purification for sins. He has already sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven. And we can be assured that we are called to follow him. And if we follow him, we can see great things in our own lives. We can see wonderful blessings, even in the midst of some of maybe the negative things that we go through in this life. God works it all together for good, somehow, and eventually. Even though us living through it, sometimes it can be hard for us to make heads or tails out of it. But God is still in control. We are called to listen to him, to be guided by him, to love him, and to be faithful to him. Joseph can serve as a wonderful example of that type of patience, that type of faithfulness in God. Perhaps we can live our lives that we can have that type of faith in our God as well.
Lord, unto